White woman calls 911 on black girl, shakes in fear, when FBI chief mom steps out of SUV. The golden sun bathed Willow Creek in a warm glow, its pristine streets alive with the distant laughter of children and the soft chime of bicycle bells. On Maple Street, families strolled past Sweet Scoops, the town's beloved ice cream shop. Outside, Danielle Hamilton tapped her bright yellow sneakers against the pavement, the scent of fresh waffle cones and caramel swirling around her. She had spent the morning lost in a Nancy Drew mystery at the library. Now she was simply waiting for her best friend Tess to return with their cones. It should have been just another uneventful afternoon. But Danielle was being watched. Across the street, Michelle Saunders narrowed her eyes. She had just stepped out of Manny's Brew, a steaming vanilla latte in hand, her phone gripped in the other. Dressed in tailored slacks and a crisp blouse, she exuded the poised elegance of someone who believes in order and who believes in keeping things exactly as they should be. And right now, something felt wrong. Her gaze locked onto Danielle, a girl alone, not part of any family gathering, not engaged in conversation, just standing there. Michelle's heart beat just a little faster. She took a slow sip of her coffee, pretending to be casual, but her mind was already working, already turning what should have been an innocuous sight into something sinister. Maybe it was the way Danielle kept glancing at the cars parked along the curb. Maybe it was the way she occasionally adjusted the strap of her backpack. Maybe it was the color of her skin, though Michelle would never admit that part to herself. But to Michelle, it was obvious. She's up to something. She had heard about the recent thefts in town. A few cars had been broken into. Nothing major, some missing sunglasses, a stolen phone charger, but enough to put everyone on edge. And now here was this black girl alone, just lingering. Michelle knew what she had to do. Her fingers tightened around her phone. She tapped the screen, dialing the only number that seemed appropriate for such a situation. 911. Yes, police? I'd like to report a suspicious individual, a young black girl, maybe 11 or 12. She's loitering outside the ice cream shop. Her voice was crisp, measured calm, but firm. She made sure to sound reasonable, to make it clear that she wasn't overreacting. She's looking into cars, Michelle continued, eyeing Danielle like a hawk. She keeps shifting around like she's waiting for someone to leave their vehicle unattended. I think she might be checking if the doors are unlocked. A pause. Yes, I'm at Maple Street, just outside Sweet Scoops. Please send an officer. She ended the call with a smug certainty, feeling the satisfaction of someone who had just done their civic duty. Danielle, still blissfully unaware, pulled out her phone, scrolling through her messages as she waited for Tess. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever. A minute later, she looked up and saw Michelle Saunders staring at her, a cold, assessing look. Not curiosity, not kindness, but something sharper, something dangerous. Danielle's stomach twisted. She wasn't a stranger to being watched. Growing up in Willow Creek, she had learned from an early age that some people saw her differently. Teachers who acted overly cautious when she raised her voice. Shop owners who watched her more closely when she walked down an aisle. But this was different. This was hostile. Then Michelle took one deliberate step forward. Excuse me, she said, her voice clipped and sharp. What exactly are you doing here? Danielle blinked. She glanced around, unsure if the woman was talking to someone else. But there was no one else nearby. I'm just waiting for my friend, she said, her voice polite but cautious. Michelle's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look convinced. Waiting for your friend, she repeated, as if testing the words on her tongue. Right? A silence stretched between them. The air felt heavy. Then Michelle's gaze flickered down to Danielle's backpack, then to the cars parked along the curb. I saw you, she said suddenly. I saw you looking into the cars. Danielle's heart lurched. No, I wasn't, she protested, her voice rising in panic. I was just standing here. Michelle cut her off. I think you were checking to see if they were locked, she said smoothly, like she had already made up her mind. You don't have to lie. Danielle's chest tightened. Why was this happening? Her breath quickened. A part of her wanted to run, to just get away from this woman, but she knew better. Running would only make her look guilty. So she stood there frozen as Michelle pulled out her phone again. Danielle's stomach dropped. The realization slammed into her like a freight train. She's calling the police. A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. Her legs trembled. This can't be happening. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just waiting for ice cream. But as she watched Michelle's lips move, as she saw the woman's gaze flick toward her with that same look, the look that said, "I know what you are," Danielle felt something she had never felt before. Real, unfiltered terror. She reached for her phone with shaking hands, scrolling through her contacts. She had to call someone, her mom, her aunt, anyone. But before she could dial, she heard it. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the calm afternoon air, sending a ripple of unease through the people gathered outside Sweet Scoops. Flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser cut across the golden glow of the setting sun, casting long, flickering shadows on the pavement. Danielle's stomach clenched. She had never been in trouble before, never even spoken to a police officer up close. But now, as the patrol car screeched to a halt, she felt an icy dread coil around her chest. The door swung open. Officer Barry Wilson stepped out first, his movements calm and measured. He was in his early 40s, with a broad build and an expression that seemed neutral, unreadable. Beside him, Officer Linda Markham followed, her sharp eyes scanning the scene, taking everything in with an air of careful scrutiny. Before either officer could speak, Michelle Saunders charged forward. "That's her! That's the girl I was telling you about. I saw her sneaking around looking into cars. She was trying to break in." The weight of those words hit Danielle like a physical blow. Her breath hitched. The murmur of bystanders grew louder, their heads turning, eyes filled with curiosity, judgment, hesitation. Danielle shook her head frantically, her voice coming out uneven, high-pitched. "No, no, that's not true. I wasn't doing anything." Officer Wilson raised a hand, signaling for quiet. His gaze shifted from Michelle to Danielle, his posture steady, but his eyes watchful. "Young lady," he said, his voice even but firm, "can you tell me what you were doing here?" Danielle forced herself to breathe, though her lungs felt tight, her heartbeat erratic. "I was just waiting for my friend," she said, her voice trembling. "She's inside getting ice cream. I wasn't near any cars, I swear." But Michelle cut in again, her voice rising. "She's lying," she spat. "I saw her. She was moving between cars, checking door handles." Danielle's eyes widened in pure terror. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. And yet, the way Michelle said it with such conviction, such righteous certainty, made it sound believable. She turned desperately to Officer Markham, whose expression remained impassive, though her gaze lingered on Danielle for a moment longer, as if searching for the truth beneath the fear in the girl's eyes. I didn't," Danielle gasped. "I swear, I was just standing here," Michelle snorted, crossing her arms. "Right, just standing there," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because that makes so much sense." The words stung. The crowd watched, silent, waiting, and Danielle felt the suffocating weight of their doubts, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Was Michelle telling the truth? Was this girl really a thief? She had done nothing wrong. But standing there surrounded by flashing lights, the cold scrutiny of uniformed officers, the judgment of strangers, Danielle felt like a criminal. Danielle's heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic thudding louder than the murmurs around her. She could feel the stares, the silent judgment, the weight of unseen accusations pressing down on her. But Michelle wasn't finished. "She has no adult with her," Michelle declared, her voice rising, cutting through the thick air like a blade. "No parents, no guardians." She turned sharply toward Officer Wilson, her certainty unwavering, her expression twisted with triumph. "What kind of child is just wandering around alone?" Danielle froze. The words landed with devastating force. It wasn't just an accusation anymore. It was a narrative, one being shaped right in front of her. A troublemaker, the runaway, a problem child with no supervision, no discipline, no one to vouch for her innocence. Danielle opened her mouth to protest, but her voice caught in her throat. What could she even say? She wasn't alone. Tess was inside. Her mother, though not physically here, was real, present, strong. But the way Michelle spoke made it sound like she was just another forgotten kid, a nameless delinquent drifting through town. The whispering started, soft at first, then growing. Maybe she really was up to something. I mean, where are her parents? She looks so young to be out here alone. Danielle's breath quickened. She turned, scanning the small crowd forming around her, searching for a friendly face, anyone who would speak up. But there was only silence. People watched, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled suspicion. But no one stepped forward. No one said, "Hey, I saw her! She didn't do anything." No one defended her. They just stood there observing, detached, as if watching a scene from a play they had no part in. Danielle's fingers clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Why was no one helping her? "I don't know why you're making such a fuss," Michelle continued, her voice sharp, theatrical, as though she were performing for the crowd. "We see this all the time. Young kids, no supervision, getting into trouble, and then what?" She turned to Officer Wilson, feigning exasperation. "Then when something happens, everyone wonders why no one stepped in sooner." Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. He wasn't entirely convinced, but the pressure of the scene, the expectation hanging in the air, was heavy. Danielle felt her legs weaken, her breath coming faster, more shallow. This wasn't about what she had or hadn't done. This was about what they had already decided she was, and no one was going to stop it. Just as the tension outside reached a suffocating peak, Officer Markham made her decision. Officer Linda Markham stepped toward the entrance of Sweet Scoops, her expression unreadable, but her posture radiating purpose. The doorbell chimed sharply as she pushed inside, the cool air conditioning a stark contrast to the oppressive heat and tension outside. Behind the counter, Mr. Guzman, the shop owner, looked up, his hands mid-motion as he scooped ice cream into a waffle cone, his brow furrowed at the sight of the officer. "Is something wrong, officer?" Markham didn't waste time. "I need access to your security footage. Now." Guzman hesitated for only a second before nodding, setting down the cone and motioning toward the back room. She followed him briskly through the narrow hallway, past stacks of supply boxes, and into a small, dimly lit office. A flickering monitor sat on the desk, its screen split into 4 grainy black and white feeds, capturing different angles of the store's exterior and interior. She leaned in, her sharp gaze scanning the time-stamped footage. There was Danielle exactly where she had claimed to be, standing near the entrance, not moving, not lurking near cars, not doing anything remotely suspicious. Markham rewound the footage, watching carefully, frame by frame. Nothing. Outside, the accusations were raging on, Danielle's fear mounting under the weight of unfounded blame. And here on the screen was the truth. Clear, undeniable, yet somehow still not enough. Markham's jaw clenched. She turned toward Guzman. "I need this footage, now!" As the minutes dragged on and Officer Markham remained inside reviewing the footage, the tension outside only grew thicker, heavier, more suffocating. The air outside Sweet Scoops was thick with tension, the weight of accusation and silence pressing down on Danielle like an unbearable force. She could feel the heat of 100 stares, the unspoken judgments lurking behind curious, indifferent, or even mildly entertained expressions. But none of them, not a single one, stepped forward to defend her. And Michelle knew it. She stood tall, her pinched smirk barely concealing the satisfaction that gleamed in her cold blue eyes. She had control. She had the power here. And she was going to make sure Danielle felt every ounce of it. "You can stop the act now," Michelle said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Poor little girl, pretending she's just waiting for a friend. How original." Danielle's breath hitched. She tried, but the words died on her tongue. Michelle took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Predatory, calculated. "What's next?" she mused, tilting her head as if genuinely curious. "Are you going to cry? Maybe beg? Oh, or wait, you're going to say I'm the bad guy, aren't you?" She laughed, a low, sharp sound that sliced through the thick air. "Oh, sweetheart, that won't work. Not here." Danielle's fingers dug into her palms. Her heart pounded, her chest tight with something thick and suffocating. She wasn't acting. She wasn't pretending. She had done nothing wrong. But Michelle had already spun the story, already painted her as the villain, and no one, not a single person, in that growing crowd was challenging it. With trembling fingers, Danielle reached for her phone. Her mother. She just had to call her mom. She fumbled, nearly dropping it, her vision blurring as she desperately tapped the familiar number. The dial tone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Then voicemail. Danielle felt her stomach drop. Number, no, 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 no. She pulled the phone away, blinking fast, trying again. But the moment she hit redial, Michelle's laughter broke through the static of panic in her mind. Oh, that is just adorable, she sneered. Danielle looked up, heart pounding, only to see Michelle watching her, with a smirk so sharp it could cut glass. You actually think someone's coming to save you? Michelle cooed, her voice mocking, taunting, merciless. Oh, sweetheart, she sighed dramatically, shaking her head in mock pity. It's useless to call anyone, little one. The words hit like a slap to the face. A fresh wave of shame and terror crashed over Danielle, so intense it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. She felt exposed, small, like nothing. Michelle knew her mother hadn't answered. She knew Danielle was alone in this moment, and she was relishing it. Danielle's fingers tightened around her useless phone. The screen blurred as her eyes burned with unshed tears. Why wasn't anyone saying anything? She looked around, desperate for one face, one voice, one single sign that someone saw the truth. But there was nothing. Only the low murmurs of bystanders, the sideways glances, the uncomfortable shifting of feet. Not one person stepped forward. A lump lodged itself in her throat, thick and painful. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe, to hold it together. She would not cry, because if she did, Michelle would win, and she could not let that happen. But Michelle saw the struggle, the way Danielle's lips trembled, the way her shoulders hunched inward, the way her breath hitched as she fought to keep the tears at bay. And she smiled, because she had already won. Such a shame, she mused, shaking her head in mock disappointment. If only you had thought of a better excuse. Danielle felt sick. Her nails bit into her palms, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her silence only fueled Michelle's confidence. She won't even defend herself, Michelle said loudly, turning toward the gathered crowd, inviting them into the spectacle. Doesn't that tell you everything you need to know? A few people nodded, others simply looked away, but still no one spoke up. Danielle's heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic thudding louder than the murmurs around her. She could feel the stares, the silent judgment, the weight of unseen accusations pressing down on her. But Michelle wasn't finished. Danielle felt like she was drowning in an invisible tide, trapped in a current she couldn't fight. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Her voice, her truth, meant nothing here, because Michelle had already decided who she was, and so had everyone else. The reality of it settled over her like a crushing weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a distant memory, a warning she had always known to be true. There will be people who see you as a threat no matter what you do. No matter how kind, how smart, how good you are, they will look at you and decide you don't belong. And sometimes, baby, they will make the world believe them. And that was exactly what was happening now. Danielle wasn't a kid waiting for ice cream anymore. She was a suspect, a criminal in the making, a dangerous little girl with no parents around to control her. Her hands shook, her lungs burned. And still, Michelle stood there, watching her crumble, delighting in it. Danielle felt like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from, and no one was coming to save her. As the door of Sweet Scoop swung open with a sharp chime, all heads turned. Officer Markham emerged, her face set in a mask of cold neutrality. In her hand, a small USB drive glinted under the afternoon sun, a piece of evidence that should have ended everything. But the moment her eyes met Danielle's, filled with fear and desperation, she knew this wasn't over yet. All eyes snapped to her. The tension crackled in the air, thick with anticipation. Officer Wilson, still standing beside Michelle, straightened. "Well?" he asked, his voice measured. Markham took a deliberate breath, then turned toward the small crowd. "The security footage is clear," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. Danielle Hamilton never left her spot near the entrance. She never approached any vehicles. She didn't touch a single car. For a moment, there was silence. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. That should have been it. That should have been enough. But then, Michelle scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the moment like a blade. "Oh, come on," she snapped, crossing her arms, her eyes narrowing into slits. "That footage can't catch everything, you know that." Danielle's stomach sank. Wilson frowned. "Ma'am, the footage was clear." Michelle's lips twisted into a mocking smirk, her head tilting slightly, as if she couldn't believe she was the only one seeing the obvious truth. "Well, maybe the camera angle missed it," she said smoothly, her voice dangerously convincing. "Maybe she was smart enough to stay in its blind spots. You really think a security camera is infallible?" The murmurs in the crowd shifted. Doubt. Doubt. Even with evidence, even with proof, Michelle still found a way to keep the accusation alive. Danielle's fingernails dug into her palms. She wanted to scream, to shout at the top of her lungs, to demand how. How could someone look at cold, indisputable proof and still find a way to twist it against her? But she already knew the answer, because people like Michelle didn't need proof. They just needed a story that fit their version of reality. Markham's jaw tightened, her patience clearly thinning. "Mrs. Saunders," she said, her voice clipped, "the footage covers the entire front of the store. If Danielle had moved toward any of the vehicles, we would have seen it." Michelle didn't flinch. "Well, maybe she was just smart enough to stay in the blind spots." Danielle's stomach clenched. It didn't matter. The proof was right there, and it still wasn't enough. "Let me get this straight," Markham said, her patience visibly thinning. "We have clear footage proving that Danielle did nothing, and your response is that the cameras must have missed it?" Michelle smiled, smug, confident. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The words landed like a slap to the face. Danielle felt the oxygen drain from her lungs. She wasn't just being accused of something she didn't do. She was being denied the right to innocence, because Michelle had already decided, and no amount of evidence would ever change her mind. Officer Wilson exhaled, shaking his head. "Unless you have actual evidence, ma'am, we have no reason to pursue this further." Michelle let out a mocking laugh, shaking her head. "Fine, if you say so." Like she was humoring them, like she was the real victim here. Danielle's fist clenched so tightly her fingernails bit into her palms. This wasn't just justice. This wasn't fairness. This was what it meant to be seen as guilty before proven innocent. And just as the weight of it all threatened to crush her, a sound cut through the tension. A low, rumbling hum sliced through the thick tension, drawing every pair of eyes toward the street. The sound was deep, commanding a presence before the figure was even revealed. A sleek black SUV rolled onto the scene, its dark-tinted windows glinting like obsidian under the setting sun. It didn't just drive, it glided, slow, deliberate, as if the driver already knew that every gaze was locked on them. The murmurs grew louder, confusion and curiosity rippling through the crowd like an electric current. Danielle's heart pounded. Michelle's smirk wavered. Even officers Wilson and Markham stiffened, their hands twitching at their belts, their postures subtly adjusting as if bracing for something big. The SUV came to a controlled stop, its engine purring like a restrained beast before cutting off entirely. A moment of complete silence followed. Then the door opened, and as the figure stepped out, the air itself seemed to shift, thick with an undeniable authority. Danielle felt it in her bones. Something had just changed. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. A heavy silence settled over the crowd as the SUV door swung open. The air felt charged, electric, as though the entire street had been pulled into the gravitational force of what was about to unfold. A woman stepped out, not just any woman. Marcia Hamilton, Danielle's mother. But more than that, the director of a special FBI unit. She was dressed in a crisp navy suit, her posture exuding authority, precision, control. Her dark skin gleamed under the afternoon sun, her expression carved from stone, unreadable yet undeniably commanding. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause, didn't glance at the murmuring bystanders or the stiffening officers. Her eyes locked onto one person, Michelle Saunders, and she walked straight toward her. The way she moved, measured, deliberate, absolute, made people instinctively step back, as if some unspoken law of nature had ordered them to. Even Michelle flinched. She had stood tall just moments ago, smug, untouchable, certain of her righteousness. Now she looked as if she had just realized she was standing on the wrong battlefield. Marcia stopped just a foot away from her. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, but it carried the weight of a loaded gun. "Do you have any evidence that my daughter committed a crime?" Michelle blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. She stammered, glancing toward the officers for support, but none came. Officer Wilson and Markham stood still, their faces unreadable. Marcia didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let Michelle escape the question. "Yes or no?" The silence was crushing. Michelle swallowed, her throat working as she scrambled for an answer. I saw her acting suspiciously," she finally muttered, but the certainty was gone from her voice. Marcia tilted her head, assessing her like a predator sizing up a trembling animal. "Suspicious how?" she asked, her tone still controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now. Michelle's jaw tightened. "She was standing there just looking at cars." Marcia's nostrils flared ever so slightly. "So, let me get this straight," she said, taking a step closer, her voice a blade slicing through the air. "You called the police, you what forced my daughter to stand here in front of a crowd, humiliated her, terrified her." Her voice lowered, but the intensity only grew stronger. "And you did all of that because she was standing?" Michelle flushed, her breath quickening. "That's not what I meant," she snapped, but the usual arrogance was crumbling, slipping through her grasp like sand. Marcia didn't give her room to recover. "Then what did you mean?" Michelle's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around as if searching for an escape, for someone to step in and save her. No one did. She licked her lips. "Look, I was just being careful. There have been thefts, and I thought—" Marcia leaned in ever so slightly, her eyes locking onto Michelle's with piercing precision. "Thought what?" she asked softly. Michelle froze. Marcia didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let up. And then she delivered the final blow. "Or is the only reason you called the police because my daughter is black?" The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Michelle's face drained of color. The crowd went completely still. Someone gasped. Danielle stopped breathing. Michelle's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her fingers curled around her handbag, knuckles white, her body rigid with the effort to contain the sheer panic flickering in her wide eyes. She wanted to deny it. She needed to deny it, but she couldn't, because Marcia hadn't left her any room to, because everyone was watching now, because the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth, had just been spoken out loud. And for the first time since this all started, Michelle Saunders had nothing to say. The silence that followed Marcia's words was suffocating, stretching out over the crowd like a thick, unrelenting fog. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself seemed to tighten, charged with something heavy, something undeniable. Then Marcia shifted her gaze slow, deliberate, turning her attention away from Michelle and fixing her piercing stare directly onto the two officers. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and unwavering, each word carrying the weight of an unshakable authority. "Is my daughter being charged with a crime?" The question hung in the air, slicing through the tension like a blade. Officer Wilson stiffened, his jaw tensed, and for a brief moment he hesitated, as if fully realizing who he was speaking to. This wasn't just a furious mother standing before him. This was Marcia Hamilton, an FBI director, a woman who had undoubtedly handled situations far more intense than this. a woman who understood the law inside and out. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for evasion. So, he answered immediately. "No, ma'am," Wilson said, his voice steady but careful. "We have no evidence against your daughter." The words rippled through the crowd. Danielle exhaled sharply, a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. Marcia's eyes didn't leave Wilson's face. "Then explain to me," she continued, her voice edged with controlled fury, "why my daughter was detained in the middle of the street, surrounded by police, accused in front of an entire crowd, if you had nothing." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Beside him, Officer Markham kept her expression neutral, but the slight tightening of her shoulders suggested she knew exactly how badly this had gone. Danielle felt the heat of every stare on her, but for the first time since this nightmare began, it wasn't just judgment, it was realization, awareness. The truth, now spoken aloud, could not be ignored. A new tension gripped the air, heavier than before, no longer directed at Danielle, but at the woman who had started it all. Marcia did not look away. Her presence was immovable, unshaken, a force standing firm in the wake of Michelle's unraveling. The street, once filled with doubt and quiet complicity, was shifting. The murmur of the crowd grew, voices no longer just whispers of curiosity, but something stronger. Disapproval, outrage, realization. Then Marcia spoke, and when she did, her words landed like thunder. "My family will be filing a lawsuit against you, Mrs. Saunders." Michelle visibly flinched, her face draining of color. But Marcia wasn't done. For defamation, for filing a false police report, and for racially motivated harassment. The words cut through the air like the snap of a judge's gavel. Michelle's mouth opened and closed, a panicked gasp escaping as she tried to comprehend what was happening. Her eyes darted toward the officers, toward the faces in the crowd, searching for any sign of support, any escape from the walls closing in around her. None came. Instead, all she found were glares. Eyes that once held hesitation now brimmed with something far more damning contempt. She stumbled over her words, her voice breaking, the smug confidence she had wielded so effortlessly now nowhere to be found. I was just trying to protect my neighborhood," she blurted, desperation creeping into every syllable. Marcia tilted her head, studying her like a case file she had already solved. "From what, exactly?" Michelle's throat bobbed, her hands gripping her expensive handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. I thought she was... Thought she was what?" Marcia pressed, her voice sharp, relentless. "A child? Standing in front of an ice cream shop?" Michelle flushed a deep red, her breathing uneven, eyes still darting for an ally in the growing crowd. But she found nothing, because now the crowd was turning on her. "She didn't even do anything," someone muttered. A woman near the back crossed her arms, shaking her head. "Calling the cops on a kid? Seriously?" A middle-aged man let out a scoff, his voice dripping with disgust. "So all it takes to be a suspect now is waiting for ice cream." A younger woman, standing beside her stroller, gave Michelle a long, cutting look. "You should be ashamed of yourself." Michelle's breath hitched, her face twisting in disbelief. I was just trying to be cautious," she stammered, her voice rising in frantic protest. But the weight of the moment had already crushed her defense before she could build it. The same crowd that had once stood silent, content to watch, had now turned against her. And Michelle Saunders was standing alone. "Cautious?" Marcia repeated, her voice icy, unwavering. Cautious would be asking questions before dialing 911. Cautious would be not assuming guilt based on nothing but skin color. Michelle's breath shuddered, but Marcia did not stop. "Instead, you put my daughter through humiliation and fear. You wasted police resources, and you let this community believe for even a second that she was a criminal." Danielle's fingers curled into fists at her sides, because finally, the truth was being said out loud. Michelle let out a shaky laugh, weak and brittle. "It was just a misunderstanding," she tried. "No," Marcia cut in, her tone like steel. "It was a choice." Michelle's face twisted, her panic morphing into something desperate and ugly. "You can't sue me for that. I was just doing my duty as a citizen." A voice from the crowd called out, sharp, unforgiving. You mean your duty as a racist? Michelle's head snapped toward the speaker, but she didn't even know who to glare at anymore, because now everyone was against her. Her chest rose and fell in quick, panicked gasps, her body rigid, her perfect, manicured composure shattering piece by piece. Then Marcia took a single, measured step closer, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet but devastating. You will answer for this. Michelle stumbled back, as if the words had physically struck her. Danielle watched, breathless, the power dynamic completely reversed. Just minutes ago, Michelle had been untouchable, confident, in control. And now, she was cornered, trembling, stripped of every ounce of authority she thought she had. The woman who had stood so tall just moments ago was now small, pathetic, scrambling for an escape she would never find. Because for the first time, she was the one being judged. And no one would forget what they saw today. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. It didn't take long for the news to ripple outward, spreading like wildfire through Willow Creek and beyond, setting the entire community ablaze with heated conversations. Within hours, every whisper, every glance, every quiet exchange across fences and coffee counters was infused with the story of Danielle Hamilton and Michelle Saunders. Social media became an unstoppable force, amplifying the injustice, pushing the incident from mere neighborhood gossip to an explosive wave of public condemnation. Facebook feeds lit up, comments flooding beneath posts with raw emotion and scathing outrage. Michelle's name rapidly became synonymous with prejudice, ignorance, and cruelty. Tweets bearing hashtags like Cornier, Justice for Danielle, and Stop Racial Profiling surged in relentless waves. Screenshots of Michelle's face captured at the moment her confidence crumbled under Marcia's fierce gaze circulated mercilessly, each share sharpening public contempt. Michelle had once been a respected woman. Her carefully curated reputation as the vigilant neighborhood guardian had earned her nods of approval, waves from passing neighbors, and polite invitations to community events. But overnight, her image shattered. Her digital footprint now became a permanent reminder of a single, shameful decision: falsely accusing an innocent child because of her skin color. Neighbors who once greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact, quickening their pace as they passed her perfectly manicured lawn. Invitations to weekend barbecues, once frequent and warm, vanished abruptly. Michelle felt the sting of rejection each time she opened her door to retrieve the morning paper, sensing the hidden glances, the quiet judgments from behind partially drawn curtains. At the local coffee shop, Manny's Brew, the same patrons who used to share pleasant small talk turned their backs or stared coldly when she approached. Conversations hushed, laughter ceased abruptly. Each icy glance carried an accusation, silently condemning her for what she'd done, for what she'd exposed about herself, and perhaps about them. Online, the backlash intensified, relentless and unforgiving. Her social media profiles filled with angry messages. People she barely knew felt emboldened to call her out publicly, dissecting her actions, condemning her prejudice with brutal efficiency. The phone calls began soon afterward, anonymous voices delivering furious reprimands or, worse, icy silence before abruptly hanging up. Yet even as Michelle suffered under this relentless public shaming, the injustice she'd inflicted upon Danielle resonated far deeper. The online fury brought to light other stories, other children who had silently endured similar humiliations. Danielle became a symbol, unwillingly thrust into a movement far greater than herself, her ordeal now representing something larger and more pervasive. A reflection of an ugly truth lurking beneath the idyllic facade of suburban calm. Danielle herself struggled under the intense attention. Every supportive comment, every viral hashtag, though well-intended, forced her to relive the humiliation over and over again. Schoolmates approached her cautiously, with hesitant smiles and sympathetic eyes, each look silently reminding her of the afternoon she'd spent trembling, falsely accused and terrified. Yet despite the discomfort, she found strength in the voices raised alongside hers. Marcia stood firmly at her daughter's side, fiercely protective, unwaveringly determined to confront the injustice head-on. Her presence was commanding, her resolve unbreakable. Marcia's influence helped Danielle realize that silence was no longer an option. She was not alone, and her experience, as painful as it was, had the power to spark meaningful change. Meanwhile, Michelle watched helplessly as her world unraveled, the consequences of her actions impossible to escape. Television vans parked along Maple Street, reporters knocking persistently at her door, neighbors whispering loudly enough to ensure she heard every word. Each moment felt like punishment, relentless and humiliating. Anxiety gnawed at her sleep, stole her appetite, and left her pacing the confines of her home, curtains drawn tightly to shield her from judgmental eyes. Desperation drove Michelle online, attempting feeble apologies on public forums, pleading for understanding, claiming her intentions had been misunderstood. Yet every message she posted only deepened the backlash. Commenters tore apart each sentence, challenging her sincerity, mocking her attempts to rationalize the indefensible. The woman who once held power in the neighborhood now felt utterly powerless, trapped by the very prejudices she had once weaponized. Willow Creek had awakened to an uncomfortable truth. Pristine streets, immaculate lawns, and white picket fences no longer concealed the ugly undercurrent of prejudice lurking beneath. Michelle's actions had exposed a wound many preferred to ignore, forcing the community into uncomfortable introspection. Town hall meetings filled with tense exchanges, heated debates over bias and privilege that few were prepared to acknowledge openly. Yet even amidst the turmoil, a quiet solidarity began to emerge. Strangers reached out to Danielle and Marcia with messages of support, small gestures of kindness, offers of solidarity. Community leaders began planning seminars, discussions on racial profiling, and sensitivity training for local police and citizens alike. Slowly but surely, the injustice Danielle faced began to shift from isolated outrage to an opportunity for genuine change. Michelle, isolated and increasingly desperate, tried to regain her footing, but her attempts were futile. She stood at her window, watching neighbors pass by without acknowledgement, their eyes deliberately avoiding her own, understanding clearly now that she was entirely alone, alienated by her own actions, trapped in the reality she'd crafted through prejudice and fear. In contrast, Danielle began to emerge from the shadows of her humiliation. Supported by her mother's unwavering strength, she found the courage to reclaim her voice. She spoke out at community gatherings, describing her ordeal openly, refusing to be silenced by shame or fear. Each word she spoke, though difficult, carried power and purpose, inspiring others to stand against similar injustices. The story that began with a false accusation in front of an ice cream shop was now transforming into something profound. A community once complicit in silence now chose to confront its failures. Danielle, once a victim of cruel and unjust suspicion, became a voice for change, courageously facing the painful past and helping guide Willow Creek toward a better, fairer future. But as the town slowly healed and Danielle found strength and resilience, Michelle remained isolated, haunted by her choices, forced to live each day, knowing she had forever altered her place in the community and perhaps, in her deepest, quietest moments, beginning to realize that the harshest punishment she endured was entirely of her own making. The tension inside the conference room at Willow and Company was palpable, a heavy cloud pressing down on Michelle Saunders as she sat stiffly in her seat. Through the expansive glass walls, her co-workers cast furtive glances toward her, then quickly looked away, as if the mere act of making eye contact might somehow taint them. She clasped her hands tightly, knuckles white, heart hammering uncomfortably in her chest. For the first time, she felt utterly vulnerable, exposed beneath the harsh scrutiny of those who had once admired her. Across from her, Lisa Wang, the head of human resources, cleared her throat sharply. Lisa was composed, professional, but her eyes held no warmth. Next to her, Andrew Carlson, Michelle's direct supervisor, sat with an expression carefully blank. A man who clearly wished he was anywhere but here. The silence lingered, excruciatingly uncomfortable, until Lisa spoke, her voice firm and clinical. Michelle, Lisa began, leaning forward slightly, hands folded on the polished table. You need to understand the severity of the situation. The incident involving Danielle Hamilton has had a significant impact not just socially, but directly on the reputation and credibility of Willow & Co. Michelle swallowed hard, a burning sensation crawling up her throat. Her carefully built life, the flawless reputation she'd spent years constructing, was unraveling with ruthless speed. Each word Lisa spoke felt like a hammer driving nails deeper into the coffin of her career. People are associating your actions with this company. We've received countless messages expressing concern, anger, even threats of boycotts. This isn't something we can simply brush aside. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed stubbornly on the tabletop. Michelle glanced at him, silently pleading for support. He refused to meet her eyes. His abandonment stung like a betrayal, a knife twisting deeper. What does this mean? Michelle managed to ask, her voice unsteady, a whisper edged with desperation. It means, Lisa continued bluntly, you'll need to attend a mandatory diversity and inclusion training program. The company expects you to fully engage and demonstrate genuine effort to understand and rectify the issues raised. Michelle felt a surge of indifference and anger battling embarrassment within her chest. Yet what could she say? How could she defend herself? Everyone had already judged her, condemned her. She bit her lip hard, tasting blood, the metallic tang sharp and bitter. She had no choice. Yes, she finally murmured, her voice small, broken. Of course, I'll do whatever the company asks. Lisa's gaze softened fractionally, though the sternness remained. I hope you understand the gravity of the situation. Your actions didn't just hurt one child, they exposed deeper prejudices that our company fundamentally rejects. Michelle nodded, unable to look up. Her reputation, she realized, would never fully recover. The carefully curated image she once projected had shattered beyond repair. The thought was terrifying. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of Willow Creek, Danielle Hamilton sat on the edge of her bed, eyes swollen and red from days of restless tears. The trauma of the incident had etched itself deep into her memory, replaying incessantly like a haunting nightmare. Danielle's chest tightened with lingering anxiety, a persistent ache of injustice. Her bedroom door opened gently, and Marcia entered, her movements calm and soothing. She settled softly beside Danielle, wrapping a comforting arm around her daughter's trembling shoulders. Danielle hesitated, her voice barely audible as she whispered the fear she'd carried since that dreadful afternoon. Mom, what if I wasn't your daughter? What if you weren't the FBI director and they hadn't bothered checking the cameras? What would have happened to me? Marcia felt her daughter's quiet agony like a physical blow. Danielle's question lingered painfully in the air, and Marcia's heart constricted. It was a truth she had confronted repeatedly throughout her career. Children, innocent children, whose lives were irreparably damaged by biases that robbed them of their dignity, their innocence, sometimes even their lives. She cupped Danielle's tear-streaked face in her hands, meeting her gaze with unwavering sincerity. You asked the right question, baby, because it's the question everyone else is afraid to ask. You're right. If they hadn't discovered the truth, your life could have been very different, and that's exactly why this has to stop. Danielle looked into her mother's fierce eyes, finding strength there, reassurance. Yet her fears remained, raw and persistent. But what about all the other kids, the ones who don't have anyone to protect them? Marcia exhaled slowly, determination crystallizing into action. Danielle's words, simple and honest, struck a profound chord deep within her. The idea of countless innocent children forced into the same terrifying vulnerability as her own daughter was unbearable. She realized then that silence was complicity, and her position demanded action beyond comforting words. You're right, Marcia declared, rising from the bed with newfound purpose. This isn't just about you. It's about every child who has been wrongfully accused, every family who's lived through this trauma without justice. Someone needs to speak up, to stand up, and make sure this never happens again. In that moment, Something shifted within Marcia, igniting a fire that would not be extinguished. She would leverage her power, her connections, her voice to address the rampant abuse of emergency calls fueled by racial prejudice. The battle would not be easy, and she knew it would force uncomfortable conversations, fierce resistance, and painful introspection from the community she loved. Yet she was determined to turn her daughter's personal nightmare into a catalyst for lasting change. Within weeks, Marcia launched a high-profile campaign called 911 Without Bias, aimed at combating racially motivated emergency calls. Her influence opened doors quickly. Local and national media picked up Danielle's story, amplifying awareness. Marcia stood on stages, faced television cameras, and spoke passionately, her voice unwavering, her presence commanding. She made it clear this campaign wasn't just for Danielle, it was for every child who wasn't as fortunate. She challenged authorities to implement tougher consequences for misuse of emergency services and urged communities nationwide to educate themselves about the devastating impacts of racial bias. Meanwhile, Michelle found herself increasingly isolated, haunted daily by the consequences of her actions. The diversity training sessions felt humiliating, but gradually she began to understand the gravity of her prejudices. Every uncomfortable conversation forced her to reflect upon the biases she'd long denied existed within her. Yet despite her slow awakening, Michelle knew her reputation was irreversibly damaged. Willow Creek no longer viewed her as an upstanding citizen. She had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of ignorance and intolerance. The weight of public condemnation never lifted, reminding her daily of the irreversible damage she'd caused. For Danielle, healing came gradually, empowered by watching her mother's courage ignite change. The pain of that afternoon lingered, a scar she carried, but Marcia's steadfast determination taught Danielle that injustice could be confronted. Trauma could be transformed into strength. One evening, Marcia stood before a packed town hall, her voice resonant, filled with conviction. My daughter's suffering wasn't unique. Every day, children across this country endure what Danielle faced, but without someone to defend them. It stops now. This is our moment to end discriminatory 911 calls, to build a community where our children are protected, not targeted. As applause thundered, Danielle watched from the front row, pride swelling within her. She understood then, more deeply than ever, that what had happened to her was unjust, but it had sparked a fight worth waging, not just for her, but for every child who faced prejudice alone. And Michelle, alone and isolated in the back of the room, watched as the woman she'd wronged stood tall, a beacon of strength and resilience. In that moment, Michelle finally understood. Her punishment wasn't just social ostracization or mandatory training. It was living with the reality that her prejudice had ignited a movement far greater than herself. A movement determined to erase the very biases she'd once silently harbored. In the quiet aftermath, beneath the waves of public activism, Danielle and Marcia found comfort in knowing they had turned a painful injustice into meaningful change. Together, they had confronted the darkest elements of human nature and emerged stronger, determined that no child would ever again face the nightmare Danielle had endured. Willow Creek had always prided itself on its quiet charm, the picture-perfect suburb where lawns were immaculate, picket fences pristine, and smiles abundant. Yet beneath that polished facade, something darker had been unearthed, a wound that couldn't simply be covered again with forced smiles and polite small talk. The town had changed, awakened by Danielle Hamilton's public humiliation, and it demanded more than shallow apologies or temporary outrage. It demanded accountability. On a crisp Saturday morning, the community hall at Willow Creek's public library buzzed with anticipation. Rows of chairs filled quickly as residents filed inside, their murmurs blending into a hum of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. On stage, a large banner proclaimed boldly, "Confronting bias, creating change." People of every age and ethnicity filled the seats. Neighbors who'd once stood by silently were now ready to face their town's uncomfortable truths. Among them sat Danielle, flanked by her mother, Marcia, whose steely resolve had galvanized the town into action. Danielle's heart still ached with memories that refused to fade. She could still feel the stares, hear Michelle's sharp accusations, sense the suffocating pressure of standing alone in judgment. But today, Danielle was determined to find strength amid the lingering pain. The hall quieted abruptly as Michelle Saunders walked in, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, face pale and drawn with anxiety. The whispers followed her like a relentless shadow. She moved hesitantly, avoiding eye contact, and took a seat at the very edge of the aisle, isolated yet inescapably visible. Her once impeccable poise was gone, replaced by palpable anxiety and vulnerability. The moderator took the stage, clearing his throat sharply into the microphone, signaling the start of the seminar. Today, he began, his voice firm yet warm, we confront our biases, we confront injustice head-on, we listen, and we commit ourselves to meaningful change. Danielle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, fighting a knot in her throat. The past weeks had been exhausting, yet oddly empowering. She glanced over at her mother, whose unwavering expression gave her strength. Marcia reached for Danielle's hand, squeezing gently in silent reassurance. As speakers shared their experiences, raw emotions filled the room. Victims of discrimination recounted their own humiliating stories, painfully similar to Danielle's. Her stomach twisted in empathy, her pulse quickened with each painful detail. The injustice wasn't isolated, it was woven deeply into their lives, repeated again and again, unchecked by a society that preferred blindness to uncomfortable confrontation. Then, with a tremble of apprehension, Michelle rose slowly from her seat. The room hushed immediately, all eyes turning toward the woman who had ignited the storm. Her breathing was shaky as she approached the microphone. Hands trembling visibly, she began to speak, her voice barely audible. I've made mistakes, Michelle stammered, clearing her throat as it tightened with emotion. She glanced toward Danielle, her eyes full of guilt and apprehension. I was wrong, horribly, undeniably wrong. I allowed my prejudice to blind me. I let fear control me, and because of that, I hurt an innocent child. Michelle paused, blinking back tears as she fought to regain control of herself. The silence around her was deafening. Danielle's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears as she listened to the woman who'd humiliated her admit openly, publicly, that her actions were unjustifiable. I was wrong to call the police, Michelle continued, her voice wavering. There was no excuse, no misunderstanding, just my own prejudice. Danielle Hamilton, I owe you an apology, not just words, but action. Real change. And I want everyone here to witness me making that commitment. Her words settled heavily over the audience. For a long, tense moment, no one moved or spoke. Finally, scattered murmurs broke the silence. Quiet acknowledgement, tentative acceptance. Yet Danielle couldn't feel relief. Not entirely. The apology, as sincere as it seemed, couldn't erase the trauma, the memories of being targeted, singled out. Her mind flooded with questions she couldn't silence. What if she hadn't been Marcia Hamilton's daughter? What if the cameras hadn't recorded everything? Would she have been believed then? Michelle returned to her seat, visibly shaken. Danielle could sense the sincerity behind her words, but the scars remained deep, the injustice still raw. Still, she felt the smallest spark of relief. At least Michelle had recognized her wrongdoing. At least the community was forced to see, to hear, to feel the weight of its collective responsibility. As the conference continued, Police Chief Wilson stepped onto the stage. The room stilled again, eyes narrowing cautiously. Wilson adjusted his badge and cleared his throat. The Willow Creek Police Department has recognized that incidents like this expose deeper issues, Wilson began, his voice steady and somber. We must acknowledge our own failures. Danielle Hamilton faced injustice because of our biases and assumptions. For that, we owe her and all others who've suffered similarly a sincere apology. Danielle swallowed, heart clenching. It was surreal. An officer publicly acknowledging that the system had failed her, that her experience wasn't an isolated misunderstanding, but part of a larger, systemic issue. Wilson continued firmly, starting immediately, all officers will undergo mandatory racial bias awareness training. We owe it to Danielle and to every child who may find themselves vulnerable simply because of how they look." Applause rippled hesitantly, then strengthened, building until it echoed like thunder through the hall. Danielle's eyes burned, emotions warring within her. Yes, this was justice, or at least a step towards it. But the ache within her chest still throbbed painfully, a wound not easily healed by promises or well-intended pledges. Yet as Marcia turned toward her daughter, eyes filled with pride and resolve, Danielle felt the beginnings of something new. Hope. Not naive or blind, but cautious, realistic, ready to face whatever battles lay ahead. Weeks later, Danielle found herself joining a local youth advocacy group committed to fighting racial prejudice, discrimination, and injustice. The first meeting filled her with nervous anticipation, but as she stood before others her age, sharing her story, a fire sparked within her. She saw in their eyes not just sympathy, but solidarity, determination, and a shared hunger for real change. Meanwhile, Michelle continued to navigate a drastically altered reality. Her neighborhood now viewed her with wary suspicion. Invitations stopped arriving, casual conversations ceased. She had become a pariah, her actions a cautionary tale passed from neighbor to neighbor, whispered behind closed doors. The damage was irreparable. The respect she'd once enjoyed vanished entirely. Yet Danielle understood deeply that the price Michelle paid was insignificant compared to what could have happened. That question still haunted her. What if her mother hadn't been there? What if the footage had been inconclusive, leaving room for doubt to poison the minds of everyone around her? Driven by these thoughts, Marcia launched a campaign against racially motivated 911 calls, pushing for legislation to hold callers accountable. She spoke passionately at public forums, on national television, her voice strong and unwavering. Danielle stood beside her mother, no longer simply a victim, but a symbol of strength, of change, of a community finally reckoning with its deep-seated biases. One quiet afternoon, Danielle stood once more before Sweet Scoops. Her memories from that painful day were still vivid, impossible to forget entirely. Her hands shook slightly, the fear returning as she stared at the spot where she'd stood accused and alone. But Marcia was beside her, placing a gentle hand on Danielle's shoulder. "You don't have to be afraid," her mother whispered. "You've shown more courage than anyone here." Danielle nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. Then, hand in hand, they stepped forward, reclaiming the space that had been tainted with injustice. She would never forget what had happened. The scars remained, etched permanently into her memories. But she had changed, grown stronger, her voice rising alongside those who refused to accept silence or complacency. Willow Creek, too, had changed forever. It was no longer the quiet suburban paradise oblivious to its shadows. Now it was a town wrestling with its truths, its people learning to speak louder, act bolder, and challenge injustice rather than ignore it. And as Danielle stood, unafraid, outside Sweet Scoops, she realized her pain had sparked something powerful. A movement, a commitment, a new Willow Creek, determined that no child would ever again endure the humiliation she faced alone. The golden rays of late afternoon sunlight poured through the windows of Sweet Scoops, bathing the ice cream parlor in a comforting glow. It had been months since that harrowing day, yet the memories remained vivid, permanently etched into Danielle Hamilton's mind. She stood in the very spot where she had once trembled in fear, falsely accused, humiliated, and helpless. But now as she looked around, something profound had shifted within her. A quiet strength had taken root, replacing the anxiety that had once held her captive. Danielle glanced toward the spot on the sidewalk where she'd felt the cruel weight of Michelle Saunders' accusations. She recalled every excruciating moment, the cold glares of strangers, the flashing lights of police cars, the suffocating shame she didn't deserve. The wound had scarred, but it no longer defined her. Today, standing beside her mother, she felt taller, stronger, more resilient. Danielle was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, and something more. An emerging voice for justice. Marcia Hamilton watched her daughter closely, noticing the determined set of Danielle's shoulders, the quiet resolve behind her eyes. The events had tested both of them, forcing painful conversations and difficult confrontations. Marcia had faced criminals, interrogated suspects, dismantled dangerous plots. But nothing had challenged her as deeply as seeing her child targeted and publicly humiliated, trapped by injustice right before her eyes. She placed a gentle hand on Danielle's shoulder, silently reminding her that she was no longer alone. Danielle looked up at her mother, eyes steady, holding a clarity far beyond her years. "Mom," Danielle began, her voice clear, steady, firm with newfound conviction. "I want to join the FBI someday, just like you." Marcia blinked, momentarily surprised but quickly understanding the profound significance behind Danielle's words. Her daughter wasn't just dreaming of a future career. Danielle had found her purpose, forged from the fires of injustice she had faced and overcome. Danielle continued, her voice deepening with determination. "I want to make sure no other kid has to go through what I did. No child should ever be afraid, humiliated, or accused just because of who they are. I want to protect them. I want to fight for them." Marcia felt her throat tighten, emotions swelling fiercely in her chest. Pride filled her heart, mingled with the bittersweet realization that her daughter had grown too quickly, forced by injustice into maturity beyond her years. Yet Marcia saw clearly now that the tragedy Danielle faced had sparked something powerful and unstoppable. Marcia smiled softly, a fierce pride burning bright in her eyes as she replied gently, "You will, Danielle, and when you do, you'll change lives. You've already changed ours." They stood silently, the air thick with unspoken truths and quiet resolutions. Danielle looked once more at the street outside, recalling vividly the helplessness she'd felt that day. It would never truly leave her, but now she saw that experience for what it truly was, not a weakness, but a call to action. Danielle Hamilton had been through the darkest moments of her young life and emerged, not broken, but stronger, her spirit sharpened into a powerful force that demanded justice and dignity for all children, everywhere. Together, mother and daughter stepped out of Sweet Scoops and onto the sidewalk. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Maple Street. Danielle walked confidently now, her steps sure, steady, and purposeful. Marcia watched proudly, knowing her daughter was on the path to becoming exactly the kind of protector she had always hoped for. Danielle glanced once more toward her mother, eyes bright with resolve. Her voice filled with unwavering certainty as she said, "When I'm an FBI agent, Mom, no child will face injustice alone. I'll make sure of it." As the sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of red and orange, mother and daughter stood together, stronger than before, bonded forever by courage and conviction. Willow Creek was healing, yet their mission had only just begun. If you believe in justice, if this story resonated deep within you, please help amplify this message. Together, our voices can challenge prejudice, protect innocence, and ensure that what happened to Danielle never happens to another child again. Like this story, subscribe to this channel, and share this powerful message widely. Let us stand together, determined and fearless, in the fight against injustice, and your voice right now matters more than ever.